Hello, and welcome everybody. We've got a lot of people signed up tonight, and I know that people have signed up knowing that they will be watching in a different time zone at a different time. So we are recording this event as we usually do. We've got a really nice mix of people. There's lots of you I can see who've come from the book industry, who are illustrators, who are publishers, booksellers, as well as those people, who I know through the Blake Society. So I'll introduce myself, and then I'm going to introduce my colleague who is going to do this talk with me. So I'm Tamsin Rosewell. I work as an illustrator. I'm a trustee at the Blake Society. I was a bookseller for about 17 years, focusing on children's and illustrated books. So I've come to this with that knowledge. This is the anniversary of Maurice Sendak's death. Today, he died in 2012 on the 8th of May. So we thought it was a really good day to gather and to really celebrate, his interest, the interest in his work, the astonishing achievement and the range of what he produced as well. I'm going to introduce you to Professor Jason Whittaker. Jason, do you want to come online as well, and so everyone can see what you look like? There we are. Hello. So Jason is an author and a Blake scholar. And if this for you is something where you're perhaps exploring Blake for the first time since you were at college, or maybe even earlier, and you've come to this through an interest in Maurice Sendak, then Jason's book Divine Images is probably a really good place to start. So, oh, there we go. Got a copy to wave around. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we start. We've got quite a lot to rattle through. We decided that we weren't going to overload you with images. There are so many images that we could show you of Maurice Sendak. I've got books that I can wave around, and you will see some images on screen, but I would like to encourage you to also perhaps make a note of books that you've not come across before, and to maybe go and seek those out and to really look at those closely. So we've been fairly economical with the number of images that we're going to throw at you tonight. Do chat in the chat box, and if you would like to ask a question at the end, what I suggest to you, there's two ways of doing it. Either raise your hand, put your hand up in the little box that says, what does it say, reactions. There's a raise hand thing there, and I will keep an eye on that list, and when we get to that point I will take you in order because they come up in order on the screen. If you don't want to come on screen to do that, do ask a question in the chat, and Jason will try to keep an eye on that, as it can be quite difficult to keep an eye on the chat box as well. So on behalf of the Blake Society, welcome everybody. Ian, can we have the first image, please? Ian Frampton is behind the scenes controlling all of this, and we really couldn't do this without him. So if you hear me asking him to do things, that is who's doing it. The context of this really is ultimately about how Maurice Sendak very consciously utilised art history in his own work, and he did it in abundance with William Blake. We know, and Jason will talk about this a little bit more, how much of Blake's work he owned, how many pieces he collected over his lifetime. And there were also many images that had been pinned on his wall since childhood that belonged to Blake. And even when it's not obvious, I think most of us probably know where the wild things are. This is probably part of most of our childhood. But he kind of peeps out through that, as we'll talk about. But actually, when we come to the end of his life in his final book, we get a full Blakean landscape. So we're going to come to that. However, there's one point where William Blake and Maurice Sendak collide, and that is the screen you're looking at the moment. So this is in 1967, and his publisher, who's Bodley Head, it was their 80th anniversary, and they decided to commission Maurice Sendak to create 7 images from William Blake's Songs of Innocence, and they were made into something like a pamphlet. Only 275 of those were printed. He's probably one of the very few people who has re-illustrated Blake, fairly formally and been published in that way from a traditional publishing house. Very few of those copies survive. They do come on the market, and there's actually one of the most sought after books in the Blake environment is Maurice Sendak's retelling of, re-illustration of those poems from Songs of Innocence. They're unmistakably Blakean in their structure, and we'll come to that. Jason, do you want to talk a little bit more about sort of where this started for you in terms of Maurice and William Blake?
Yes, indeed. So whilst I want to return to particularly the image that Tamsin has there later on, the little boy lost, an interesting one that Sendak chose to illustrate. I actually want to deal with Where the Wild Things Are on a very, very personal reason. For those who know me through the Blake Society and various talks I've done, I've been researching and writing about Blake now for 30 years. But actually, Maurice Sendak, in many respects, is actually much more fundamental to my love of reading. And
Ian, do you want to move a slide on? Because I think we've got an image which
it's Where the Wild Things Are,
which will hopefully show what we mean.
So I'll begin with a very personal short narrative, which is the very famous, probably a book which got an awful lot of children reading. I would have been, I think, about 3 years old. I'm not entirely sure. It's that when reconsidering this, it's that weird dream touch time of being a child. But I was taken by my mother regularly to Cannock Library in Staffordshire, where I grew up, and I remember vividly that there was a room for children's books, children's literature, which is where I spend hours of weekends and during the week, whenever I could, my mother taking me there. And it had, brightly coloured boxes, little toadstool seats, and I would just disappear into this room while my mother was looking for various romances and crime novels and all the adult literature that was elsewhere in the library. And I have an incredibly vivid memory. It fits in this fractured landscape of myself, along with pretending to be the dog and sitting on. I noticed that when the dog sat on his back paws and raised his hands to beg, he'd get fed. So I apparently picked this up as an early habit, and I have my weight to thank for that now. Another weird early memory is standing with my hand on the television as I realised later in life David Bowie was playing Starman on Top of the Pops, and I must have been about 4 years old at that point. But another incredibly vivid memory is reading, or more accurately, responding to the images of Where the Wild Things Are, and actually going home that evening and trying with all my might to actually will my bedroom to become a forest. What I wanted to do, and I still have an incredibly vivid memory of that experience, was almost to summon up in front of me the trees so that I could go and find these monsters. I wanted nothing more than to go and live where the wild things were. And actually that's been incredibly important to me, because throughout my childhood and then my adult life, it's actually contributed to this sense of actually being able to visualize and create almost eidetic imagery by just imagining things that, of course, in the modern sense, the normal common sense way of thinking do not exist. And actually, as a child and as a teenager, this caused considerable problems for me. Effectively, I would hallucinate on a regular basis. And then I read Blake and encountered Blake, and particularly Blake's art, and realized that this was this was an entirely normal way for a Blakean to view the universe. That, of course, the world was full of these wild and imaginary and visionary things. And it was actually at that point that, this seed that had actually been planted by Maurice Sendak came to its full fruition when I then encountered the works of William Blake and read in much more detail and came to a deeper appreciation and an understanding of what Blake then saw on a common basis. A very, very, very different writer, or certainly a writer with a very different audience to Maurice Sendak. William Burroughs once said that one of the most remarkable things about Blake is that he's so generous with his angels. He literally gives them away for anybody to see. And this is something that I've responded to very, very strongly, both with Blake, but it still has this incredible childhood appeal to me with Maurice Sendak.
Thank you. Well, I'd like to move on and talk a bit about from the Blake side of things, as it were, what the children's book market, for want of a better phrase, might have looked like in Blake's time. But I've actually got a quote from an essay that Maurice Sendak wrote about what he referred to as Blake's incomparable genius. And I think it kind of echoes what you've just said in how so what he writes is how beautifully his songs of innocence and of experience could be set to music, and how beautifully Blake did set them. The intensely personal images seem to be the very embodiment of his mystical poetry. His ingenious and wonderfully ornamental interweavings of illustrations, lettering, and colour visually animate the spirit of the poetry and create a lyrical vision of otherworldliness. And it is all expressed with an economy that only masters can achieve. So that was what he wrote. And I think actually what you've said and the way you've described it is actually very similar. It's that ability and acceptance that there is that other world, that vision of other world, and in many ways it is just as real, yes, particularly to the mind of a child, I think. And if we can keep that into adulthood, it's very precious.
Which is something, I mean, that Blake himself very much believed. And actually, an important point to make with regard to, let's call it the children's book market, which begins to emerge actually about 50 years or so before Blake's birth. But at the end of the period that I'm going to look at now, which is really that growth of a market for children's literature, for books aimed at children in the 18th century, at the end, we move then into an incredible transformation, which is actually, I mean, a number of historians of the period have drawn attention to this, the reinvention of the child. At the beginning of the period, so the roots of children's literature probably really lie with John Locke in the late 17th century, and particularly Locke's notion that children are born as a tabula rasa, that they're a blank slate which will absorb the impressions of the outer world and thus form a proper view or an improper view. If they're malformed, if they're mistreated, they can actually be twisted. So what became very important to Locke in his various writings on education, for example, was that, of course, that we provide properly for children's education. And you know, the regime that he was particularly interested in was one which would be entirely antithetical to Blake. And it must also be said that whilst Locke saw the mind of a child as a tabula rasa, he was still very much part of that worldview which saw children effectively as small adults. Whilst he marked an important transition away from a notion of children as born in sin, you know, children as somehow despicably evil that you know, Christianity was going to save them from, there was still this strong sense of, you know, a child had to be molded. They had to be almost rigidly formed. Their education had to be carefully monitored. And this has an important consequence for even those liberal writers of the 18th century. And Ian, if I could ask you to move on to the next slide, please. So I just want to draw attention here that I've got 3 texts. I'll talk about these a little bit more in a moment. But just to draw attention that through the 18th century, and particularly from the 1740s onwards, there's an increasing number of books which are aimed at young children. The one on the right of the screen here, which is actually illustrated by Blake, it's Mary Wollstonecraft's original stories from real life, which actually comes at the end of the period that we're looking at, 1796. But it's very typical of the more liberal-minded works which appeared throughout the century. So the woman in the centre, Mrs. Mason, is a thinly veiled avatar, an alter ego of Wollstonecraft herself, who takes the 2 children in her care through London, through various circumstances, each of which is intended to convey a moral story. So, for example, they encounter, you know, the ruins of a wealthy palace, and this is a moral on how, you know, earthly wealth will never last, and actually you shouldn't spend too much of your self-value in such earthly goods. There's another point where they encounter a group, a poor family living in desperate poverty. And the story goes on about the filth and the smell, the dirt. And there's a great deal of sympathy that you know, Wollstonecraft herself, who had a life of incredible precariousness, well understood the dangers of poverty, but also there is an element whereby she can't help but be a little bit Eurozenic, a little bit judgmental of the fact that these poor people can't quite keep themselves clean enough. And whilst recognizing that this is an outcome of poverty, there is this slight underlying element whereby if only they had the proper moral character, they would be able better to deal with the situation which they found themselves. Now, I say that this is a kind of attitude, whether the writer is conservative or liberal, this is an attitude that tends to be very prevalent across children's literature of the 18th century. Essentially, it's didactic. Its aim is to instruct children in the proper way to live. The proper way to live, of course, being entirely dependent on the writer's own authority or morality. There are some exceptions. Christopher Smart's Songs of Amusement for Young Children is a wonderful collection. If you ever have a chance to read that, I highly recommend it. And actually is something of a precursor to Blake's Songs of Innocence in particular. But the other text I just want to draw attention to at the moment, which is on the bottom of the screen, Songs for Young Children, for the Instruction of Young Children by Isaac Watts. Now, Isaac Watts, a nonconformist minister, published these divine songs in 1715. They are, he himself, I mean, he was very interested in education. He was very concerned with the conditions of the poor. But just to give you an indication of the very, very different attitude that Watts had to Blake, I just want to read an extract from one of Watts's hymns called Praise for the Gospel, which ends, Lord, I ascribe it to thy grace, and not to chance as others do, that I was born of Christian race, and not a heathen or a Jew. I mean, it's utterly astonishing, utterly astonishing. And Blake read this book. And the reason I know this is because the end of his poem, The Divine Image, ends, and all must love the human form in heathen, Turk or Jew, where mercy, love, and pity dwell, there God is dwelling too. And there are many more examples, I'm not going to go through them, but in that simple contrast, we begin to see just how astonishing Songs of Innocence was.
Can I ask a question? You talk about how there is this kind of moralizing tendency in this children's publishing. How much of that do you think is economic? Because I notice, and we will come to this about the modern book industry a bit later, that there is a very moralizing trend, a very didactic trend. Is that economic because that's what people will pay for at this point? I mean, actually, it isn't the poorer families who are going to be paying for it. It is going to be the families who have that little bit of money.
Linked in the sense that I think it's primarily ideological. You know, the assumption grows, and it's primarily ideological for the following simple reason: parents assume that they need to start paying more attention to their children's education, and not simply, you know, teach them grammar and some Latin and, you know, the traditional mode of instruction for children from the Middle Ages onwards. And that education is driven by this morality, and so it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Because parents expect that literature needs to teach their children, they buy literature that teaches their children. So the economic rationale for this comes out because that's what parents expect. You know, the market delivers what audiences want, but audiences want what the market delivers.
Yeah.
So it's a self-fulfilling loop. And there are, I say, the important exception, which I haven't touched upon. So I'll do that very quickly, and then I'll end with the final image here, and we'll move on to the more modern situation. The main exception to this is actually Jean-Jacques Rousseau's Emile on education. Actually, a hugely problematic book, highly liberal in terms of education, if you're a boy. If you're a girl, forget about it. So massive problems. But nonetheless, Rousseau's notion of breaking down this didactic structure of instruction, whilst Blake disagreed with many ideas of Rousseau, he seems to have picked up on this new wave, which became immensely influential on later writers such as Wordsworth, Coleridge, etc. And actually, where we find, whilst he may not be directly influenced by Rousseau, the last image I want to end on here, the little caterpillar at the top of the screen with the baby in swaddling clothes, is taken from The Gates of Paradise. I actually think that this is probably one of the most influential books that Blake ever wrote, that I think is incredibly important to the modern book publishing, children's book publishing trade. And the simple reason for this is that the entire book, Gates of Paradise, was reproduced in this edition of Blake's poetry from 1927. It was the Everyman Poems and Prophecies of William Blake, which was published by Everyman, edited by Max Plowman in 1927. And it's mainly text, except towards the end, it includes a complete facsimile of The Gates of Paradise, which is intended for children and is a picture book, and includes, the famous one, I want, of somebody placing a ladder against the moon. It's these incredibly beautiful, quaint, eccentric images. And this book was widely in circulation. It was directly influential on a writer of similar age to Sendak, Alistair Gray. And I think I'm pretty sure that Sendak, in the early pre-war and interwar period, this was probably the easiest copy of Blake's poetry to get. And people who read this would have read The Gates of Paradise and come across this delightfully eccentric children's picture book, which became immensely influential, in my opinion, on children's publishing from the post-war period onwards.
Jason, can you just remind us of the name of that book? Can you just hold it up again? I think people are asking in the chat.
Poems and Prophecies of William Blake, and it's edited by Max Plowman. It comes out in 1927, and it's reprinted. It goes through hundreds of editions, well, dozens of editions, and it's a relatively cheap. In fact, it's intended as a cheap copy of Blake's poetry. It's published widely in the UK, in America in particular, also appears elsewhere. There are 450 authors. It's the beginning of the Everyman collection that we kind of know today.
Thank you. Ian, can we move on a slide? And actually, we're going to take a gigantic leap, a couple of hundred years into the future. And we're actually going to look at, I thought it'd be interesting to look at what was going on in the book industry, particularly in America, but I think this does reflect over into the UK as well, at the point at which Where the Wild Things Are was published. So this was published in 1963, won the Caldecott Medal the year after that, immediately after its publication. And the images that you're seeing on the screen are very typical of what else was on the market for children in that age group. And as Maurice Sendak put it, and his editor, discussed in public, quite publicly on the publication of Where the Wild Things Are, there had been no book before in which a child had shouted at his mother. There had been no book before in which the mother had shouted back at the child and punished him and sent him upstairs to bed. I think there are a lot of children who read Where the Wild Things Are, having been brought up on a diet of much more cozy, moralizing, didactic, very saccharine stuff like what you're looking at on the screen, and felt, I've read some contemporary quotes about Where the Wild Things Are that say, so does behavior have no consequences? Because Max, it appears, goes at, has this enormous tantrum, and a stomp, and goes off and tames wild things and gets on his boat and comes back home again. And actually the love from the parent is unconditional, that, he comes home and there is a fresh soup, still warm, waiting for him. He's got his bed, he knows he's where people love him best. And actually, I think what Maurice Sendak is doing is something so different from this that it's almost unrecognizable. I mean, you can see here that in these books, there is a lack of peril. we don't, we're used now perhaps more to seeing children's books in which there is an element of mild peril, but it's not, in my view, as a modern bookseller, you haven't really got a story unless there is some peril involved in it with your protagonist. There's a lack of anger. They're very didactic. These are books that are acceptable to adults, and I think one of the things that we do need to recognise, and part of why I asked the question to Jason earlier about this, is that when we're in this age group, it's still the parent who is largely choosing and paying for that book, and it has to be acceptable to the parent. So in many ways, you're marketing to what the parent wants to be reading, and I think that, or thinks that the child ought to be reading. And I don't know whether most parents forget what it was like to be a child, but actually, children are angry. They do have tantrums. They always have had tantrums. This is not a new thing. I think the other thing to think about in terms of what was going on when Where the Wild Things Are was published first was that this was also a huge period of change in illustration. So until the very late 1950s, publications, including magazines, had been using and really relying on illustrators for all of the images within magazine publishing. And in the late 1950s, they really start to explore using photography as an art form and recognizing photography as an art form for publications. So illustrators like Maurice Sendak, like Edward Gorey, like Andy Warhol actually went off in different directions and pursued other routes. So Andy Warhol actually went down a pure fine art route and became an artist rather than an illustrator. Edward Gorey, as far as I see, continued doing what Edward Gorey does, with his intense Gothic stuff. Although Edward Gorey did, when a lot of his style was compared to that of the early work of Maurice Sendak with the cross-hatching, did say, yeah, but Maurice Sendak is a much finer drawer than I am. I'm not really ashamed to admit that I'm one of those people who does, fairly firmly believe that literature and illustration, is capable of really broadening horizons and changing the world. But I don't think it happens through books like the ones on the screen. I think it does happen when you recognize the anger of the child. Can we move on a slide and actually look more closely at Maurice Sendak's style and his way of drawing? Now, what you're looking at on the screen are two images from this book here, which it was his last book. It's called My Brother's Book. It was published in 1993, I think. No, sorry, no, of course it wasn't published in 93. It was published in 2013, shortly after his death. It was his last published book. It's unmistakably Blakey, and I think, if you stumble across this in a secondhand bookshop and you look at it, I think even if you don't know Blake particularly well, you can see that, on his images, he's got, I'll just hold the book open so you can see how it's laid out. You can see that we've got this sense of white space, directly around. You've got the images, and the poetry. It is written in blank verse. Very really echoing Blake's way of creating a book. We've got layered watercolor. If you compare it to Where the Wild Things Are in terms of its style, then you can see we've got a very different style. We've got this dramatic contrast. We've got these bold lines, these figures, these kind of heroic nudes that are so, we see throughout all of Blake's work, these sort of dramatic flowing lines down and up, great theatrical gestures, this kind of dramatic contrast. And I'm just going to ask you, if you've got a copy of Where the Wild Things Are at home, really to look at the end papers. These are the end papers for Where the Wild Things Are. Maybe you've just turned over them in the past or when you've been reading the book to a young child, but really take a look, because I think this says a lot about, not only his working style, perhaps his connection to Blake as well. They're these kind of Matisse-like flowers that sort of explode across the page. And if you look very, very closely, you can see that they're shaded in with a very detailed cross-hatching, which, unlike the images that you're looking at on the screen, his final book, this Where the Wild Things Are is created from using a very dense cross-hatching style. Now, cross-hatching is the language and the tool of the engraver. That is how you create an image when you're engraving. And William Blake was trained as an engraver. You know, it's a skill he used all of his life. And we know that Maurice Sendak was using a very particular tool. He was using a steel crow quill nib, which itself is a tool from the 19th century. And you know, he used this throughout all his work. And you know, his Where the Wild Things Are, that cross-hatching defines everything from, you know, the what's going on the screen, on the walls, to the relationship with the little dog. We can see you know, that the cross-hatching in all the monsters. It orders the monsters in the field. And here in front of us, we've got a very different style. So as an illustrator, one thing I marvel at when I look at Maurice Sendak's work is how very versatile his style was, his groups of styles were, and how, you know, that there's a vitality to them. I read his own writing about his work, and he refers to his different lines as it almost as if they're different characters. And he has a fine line, a thin line, a fat line, and a stout line. So each of those ways of creating imagery, so I'd say that what he's created in front of us is probably his fat line, which is a bold outline of a figure. You know, we haven't got that delicate cross hatching going on anywhere on these images. We've got really bold layered watercolor. And when you compare that to actually how dark Where the Wild Things Are looks, with all that cross hatching forming the structure and the color really coming along and on top of that second, you know, you can see that those two are really different. And then if those of you who know In the Night Kitchen, which was the second in what he considered a trilogy, we can see here on this screen here that we've got a real homage to something completely different. We've got this, it's unmistakably Sendak's work, but we've got a real homage to cartoon art. You know, this is, you know, him looking at particularly at Winsor Mackay, the cartoonist Winsor Mackay, who did a cartoon strip called Little Nemo. I think it was Little Nemo, and there are a lot of visual references to that. And yet, you know, nowadays illustrators, those of you who are illustrators, will probably be quite familiar with having been told that, you know, your style needs to be consistent. It needs to, and there's nothing consistent about the way Maurice Sendak works, and it's not like it evolved from one to the other. It's constant. He uses all of them all of the time, and yet all of it is unmistakably Maurice Sendak. I'm going to, there's something else which came up, which is a really strong connection to the way that William Blake influenced Maurice Sendak and in his mind, and just one of his early experiences. Those of you who are familiar with Blake will know the stories from his early childhood of him seeing God looking in at the window, of the angels he saw in the tree. Well, Maurice Sendak too had this experience. I don't think at any point, I've never read or heard any interview which claims that he was visionary in any way. But he said he saw an angel when he was a child. His father, who was a great storyteller, probably to keep him quiet in bed, would say to him, you know, if you're very, very good and very lucky and very well behaved, if you stare out of the window and you don't blink for long enough, you will see an angel. And of course, he tried this and tried it, and he always blinked because it's very painful not to. And one day, one evening, he did look out and he managed not to blink with his eyes still hurting. And he wrote the following. He says, I was lying in the bed, staring out of the window, my eyelids aching, my eyes aching, staring, staring, staring. Something very large, almost like a dirigible, which is an early airship, but wasn't a dirigible, floated right past my window. It was a slow-moving angel. She, he, whatever, moved very gracefully and slowly, coming from left, going across to the right, not turning to observe me at all. I don't have any memory of the face, but I remember the memory of the hair, the body, the wings. It took my breath away. So that was Maurice Sendak's own early childhood experience of seeing an angel. And actually, what we don't see angels depicted so much, you know, in Maurice Sendak's work, but we do see the windows and things seen through windows, things coming in at you through windows, really do feature very, very strongly. Can we move on a slide and actually look a little bit more at this book, my brother's book? So you can see the really direct influence. So my brother's book, and this is why I just need to talk a little bit about Maurice Sendak's own background, and some of it is quite disturbing. So he was a Jew, a gay Jew. He came over, his parents came over at the outbreak of the First World War. It would seem that his father was the only member of his family who survived the Holocaust. The rest of them, he learned later, had been killed. His father had come over because he'd been chasing a girl. He'd met this girl and she'd moved to America. So he literally ran away, and that saved his life. His parents were, you know, clearly traumatized by what had been, you know, going on. They didn't understand. They didn't speak English. They, you know, wound up in America, not knowing the culture, you know, very much in a ghetto, working extremely hard to bring up the children, and didn't really, you know, have any understanding of what they should and shouldn't say to a child. So, you know, Maurice Sendak and his beloved older brother, Jack, who he is the brother of my brother's book, you know, spent an awful lot of time together and would hear them talking about children being put in ovens. This is young children. And Maurice Sendak says, you know, throughout all his life, children know you cannot lie to children. And I think this is the problem of, you know, of a book industry which is didactic and moralizing, is that the children know you're lying, and ultimately they react against that. So in my brother's book, in his last book, he writes about the death of his brother and of his lifelong partner, Eugene. He puts them together. So we have a full Blakean landscape, a cosmic event in this case. You know, a star falls and separates the two brothers. One of them ends up encased in ice, and it's almost a retelling of A Winter's Tale, you know, and a journey with a riddle, led by a bear. It's a combination of A Winter's Tale and Blake's Milton, which is the image that you can see on the left. And Blake puts himself in one position and his brother Robert, who he lost very young to, in an almost exact mirror image with the star falling between them. They're separated by a star in that case. So we have here in both Blake and Maurice Sendak a truthful, unaffected vision, which is as much for adults, you know, as for kids. And I think, you know, this, you know, what he talks about is how, you know, when an illustrator has that artistic freedom and is free from the moralizing requirements, as it were, you know, of the publishing industries, it lends that sort of vitality and that truth to those books. Can we move on, Jason, and talk more about Where the Wild Things Are, which I think will be the book that is familiar to everybody, and actually look at Little Girl Lost and the connections between that and Blake's poem Within Songs? We move on a screen, Ian, is that all right?
So before talking about Little Girl Lost, I actually want to talk briefly, and this quite briefly, about The Little Boy Lost, because The Little Boy Lost is one of the poems that Sendak overtly illustrates in his 1967 edition of Blake's Songs of Innocence. So it's one of the 7 illustrations, unlike The Little Girl Lost. And just to remind, you know, I don't know how familiar people are with Blake's Songs of Innocence and of Experience. So I'm going to start off with The Little Boy Lost, which is a very short poem. Little Boy Lost, Little Boy Found, each of them just 2 stanzas, 2 quatrains long. Father, Father, where are you going? Oh, do not walk so fast. Speak, Father, speak to your little boy, or else I shall be lost. The night was dark, no father was there. The child was wet with dew. The mire was deep, and the child did weep, and away the vapour flew. So that The Little Boy Lost, I think that poem, it conjures up a sense of dread, of fear, Not necessarily mild peril. We're not told where the little boy is lost. This could be truly frightening for the boy, but it's followed then very quickly by the little boy found. The little boy lost on the lonely fen, led by the wandering light, began to cry, but God ever nigh appeared like his father in white. He kissed the child and by the hand led, and to his mother brought, who in sorrow pale through the lonely dale, her little boy weeping saw. Now, I'm not a big fan of the little boy lost and found, and I find it kind of interesting that Sendak illustrated Little Boy Lost, because whilst there's a sense of fear, a sense of peril, it's also a very clear Christian allegory. And we'll return to Sendak's lack of interest, his atheism, actually, later in this talk. But I want to compare that now to what is actually one of Blake's most astonishing poems. And actually, I wrote about this, 5 years ago in Divine Images, but I've not really returned to it since. I've returned to these poems several times in my life, but I haven't read them for a few years. And actually, the first reaction was, boy, these are long. These are longer than I remember, so I'm not going to read the whole poem. But also just how radically different they are. So the little girl lost, I'll read the beginning. In futurity, I prophetic see that the earth from sleep, grave the sentence deep, shall arise and seek for her maker meek, and the desert wild become a garden mild. In the southern clime where the summer's prime never fades away, lovely like a lay, 7 summers old, lovely like a told, she had wandered long, hearing wild birds' song. So Leica wanders off into the wilderness, and unlike the little boy lost, there's no fear, none whatsoever. She just heads off into the deserts, into these wild wildernesses, looking for adventure. And adventure she certainly finds. I'll jump towards the end of Little Girl Lost. Leopards, tigers play round her as she lay, while the lion old bowed his mane of gold, and her bosom lick, and upon her neck, from his eyes of flame, ruby tears there came. Now, for those of you familiar with where the wild things are, this is, let the wild rumpus begin. This is the moment where Leica, lost, having left behind the world of her parents, but very different motivations from Max in Where the Wild Things Are, but she encounters literally wild beasts and is perfectly at home. Tamsin had said previously, one of the important points about Where the Wild Things Are is that Max is not afraid of these monsters, just as Leica is not completely unafraid. And actually, just how radical the poem becomes. I always forget this and then rediscover it when I read. While the lioness loosed her slender dress, and naked they conveyed to caves the sleeping maid. Leica is so completely at home amongst these wild beasts that she literally loses all the tresses, all the remains of civilization, and literally goes to live where the wild things are. Is completely at home. And I'm absolutely convinced that although Sendak doesn't talk explicitly about Little Girl Lost and Found, I struggle to think of another story that deals with a young child wandering into the wilderness and becoming completely at home, looking for adventure, looking for wild creatures. I'm not going to read Little Girl Found in anything like the same detail, but the important point here, and this is a contrast to Sendak's story, unlike Max, who realizes that actually he is a bit homesick in the end. He does want to return home. There's a bowl of warm soup waiting for him. Leica's parents, they are beside themselves with worry. They spend 7 days and nights wandering through the wilderness, looking for the daughter. And what do they find? Lo and behold, they turn up, then they follow out where the vision led, and saw their sleeping child among tigers wild. To this day they dwell in a lonely dell, nor fear the wolvish howl, nor the lion's growl. A complete contrast to where the wild things are. The parents themselves go to live with the wild beasts. And it's also kind of significant, ends with a wolvish howl and a lion's growl. It ends with a wolf, just as Max is dressed as a wolf in Where the Wild Things Are. So I think whether explicitly or overtly, in terms of invoking the image of Leica. Sendak, it strikes me, he certainly knew the poems, because Little Boy Lost is explicitly, Little Boy Lost and Found in Innocence is explicitly contrasted to Little Girl Lost and Found in Songs of Experience. I think when it comes, although he may not have illustrated the latter, when it came to writing Where the Wild Things Are, clearly Blake's Songs of Innocence and Experience is on his mind at this point. But you know, he creates the copy, as Tamsin said, of the illustrated version of Songs of Innocence. And you know, that's a simple reason why he doesn't do Songs of Experience, because sorry, The Little Girl Lost, because that's in the next volume. He's just illustrating the first. So he's clearly thinking of these. He illustrates the poems. It's on he falls very ill on a UK book tour promoting Where the Wild Things Are. And that's one of the inspirations for giving this gift to various friends, etc., because he's very, very ill during the tour. So he knows clearly, he illustrates Little Boy Lost. He's not illustrating Little Girl Found, Lost and Found, because he's not illustrating Songs of Experience. But I actually strongly believe that Where the Wild Things Are is in many respects a retelling of Little Girl Lost and Found. Because there are very few, I cannot think, and I'll be happily take suggestions in the chat, I cannot think of a precursor where a young child willingly goes out to find wild animals. Actually, no, sorry, I'm being fair. Probably the nearest that you will actually find is in the Narnian Chronicles. And actually, C.S. Lewis knew that story as well. You know, the Vision of Aslan is a rather moralizing take on the lion that finds Leica. But there are very few stories, and Max, to me, clearly is a retelling of The Little Girl Lost and Found. There are important differences. Max is a boy, Leica is obviously a girl. The implication in Blake's stories, and a really interesting one, there's been various writers on Blake's Blake and race, and actually how it's more embedded in his writing than he explicitly says. The fact that she's in the southern climes, in the wild, and traveling through deserts, she is probably African, in the same as the little black boy, etc. The aim is that Blake here is invoking, to be honest, a thoroughly stereotypical romantic savage view of a family, of a child removed from civilization. I'll happily take questions on that during the discussion at the end. But it's still an incredible vision, which I say, one of the comments I wanted to make, following on from what you were saying earlier, Tamsin, about the book trade in the 1960s, which continues today, that didactic nature, and you have to appeal to the parents. There was a Blake scholar, his name just momentarily is literally flown out of my head, we'll come back later, who, writing in the early 2000s, said that he was commissioned by a publisher to do a children's version of Songs of Innocence and Experience. And whilst he was going through the process, you know, working out which poems they were going to include, so even Little Black Boy might be a bit racist, or the little, you know, Little Girl Lost and Found, girl found naked with animals, can't really have that in a children's book. I said, as he was going through the process, it turned out that, you know, perhaps they could include the lamb, although that was a bit Christian. It turned out there was probably nothing that Blake was writing that could be included in a modern children's book that wouldn't offend somebody. And I think that this is, there's a real appeal from both Sendak and Blake, in that, you know, they are writing for children, they're also writing for themselves, and they are not, it's not that they're ignoring the market, but they're trusting that they can operate outside the dictates of the market. And the final comment I'll just end, this comment on Little Girl Lost and Found, and Little Boy Lost and Found in Innocence and Experience. Sendak did own original copies of both the Songs of Innocence and of Blake's Songs of Experience. And after he'd become famous, after he'd made, it must be said, an awful lot of money from the sales of Where the Wild Things Are, he actually purchased 2 of the original copies, H and J, of Blake's Songs of Innocence and Experience. And just to end on a final, less salutary note, after his death, they'd been left at the Rosenbaum Museum, but in his will, he indicated that he wanted his books to go to the Morris Sendak Foundation. And the museum said, Well, actually, Songs of Experience, I think it was, it's not bound, it's a collection of loose plates. So it's not technically a book, so we don't have to send this back. So this is because, of course, it is worth a huge amount of money. So whilst Blake did not write for a market in the same way, those original copies of Innocence and Experience have become immensely valuable in ways that Blake would never have comprehended to particular markets.
Thank you, Jason. Couple of observations. But firstly, I really could have found a better image of Little Girl Lost, couldn't I? I do apologise. I didn't make it deliberately blurry, so you all have to go and look it up again. But yeah, sorry, that's my fault doing that. It was me that made a lot of these images. One observation. You talk about how, you know, actually she loses her garments throughout this process of rewilding, as it were. Somebody talk about it as rewilding. Maurice Sendak does exactly the same thing, and in the night kitchen, in which little Mickey literally he falls in his dream out of his clothes and into and you know this is a child processing, you know, overhearing parents talking about small children being put into ovens, and here he is being baked by these kind of bloated, oversized Oliver Hardy type characters. A very different style again from what you're looking at on the screen, where you can see that cross hatching. You know, we can't see that here at all. This is very much a bold line. You know, and this was hugely controversial. This book has been banned because the child is nude, and yet we're happy to look at, you know, images of the Christ child nude in public sculpture in very public places, and yet it's not acceptable, you know, in a children's book. Can we move on and talk a little bit about, we're aware of time, but I really would like to talk about politics and religion and that aspect, because if we just move on one slide, what we've got is an image from a book that was published in 1993. It's called We're All in the Dumps with Jack and Guy. And interestingly, Jack and Guy are the names of the same characters that pop up in my brother's book right at the end. Jack is Jack, who's his brother, his beloved older brother. And Guy, he talks about as an incarnation, an emanation, as it were, of Jean, his long-term partner, who he was with for over 50 years. Maurice Sendak was from a Jewish background. He was a Jew. He talks about himself very much as a secular Jew. He's an atheist. He has very strong humanist leanings. We know he doesn't believe that there's an afterlife, although he does say, you know, towards the end, he's saying he doesn't believe in an afterlife, but he does believe he's going to see his brother and his beloved Jean again. And he also has this strong political sensibility in that he feels as an artist he has a responsibility to use that imagination, to use that intellect, to use that channel of communication to really talk about what's going on in the world and to tell children the truth. And I think we see this in Blake as well. I'm thinking particularly of his illustrations that, you know, show, you know, what was going on within, you know, to what was being done to slaves. You know, they're very graphic images of his. And in this particular image, what you're looking at is an earlier memory he had of seeing, you know, the foot of a very young child, you know, sticking out from a cardboard box, when, you know, the Chicago authorities were just clearing away the homeless children in the city. And in the end, he wrote it into a book. You know, it's full of humor and it's full of, you know, joyful imagery and color, but it is about, you know, the way that children are treated. It's not unlike the way that I think Blake sees, you know, his own responsibility as an artist, perhaps, is to, you know, that there's a level of communication there. I see Maurice Sendak as a very, very secular voice, although Judaism is much more than a faith. It is an entire culture, Jewish folklore. You know, the storytelling within Jewish folklore is very, you know, there are lots of grey areas. There's lots of ambiguity, which I don't think we have so much when we've sanitized, you know, the fairy tales that have come down to us in the West outside the Jewish faith. I think, you know, there is a tendency to heavily sanitize those, you know, and make them very black and white in terms of the morals. But we certainly don't see that, you know, in the Jewish traditions of storytelling. And I think Maurice Sendak carries that over. So he talks about how he loves being a Jew. He loves coming from that, rich cultural tradition, but he is secular. He's very much a secular Jew. He's an atheist. So I thought, Jason, we should talk about that, perhaps, is this a conflict between the atheism of one and the deep Christianity of the other?
Yes and no. So before we were doing this talk tonight, Tamsin and I were talking, well, I was telling Tamsin whilst writing Divine Images, and I've had this problem for 30 years. People often ask me, what kind of Christian was Blake? And what they mean is, we've read somewhere there's dissenting, etc. There's lots of work being done in recent years on the Moravianism of Blake's mother.
We've got Swedenborg as well in there somewhere.
But he was a Swedenborgian for 3 months. I mean, he dabbled with Swedenborgianism, etc. And whilst I was rereading Blake's works quite deeply, and I kept coming across, frankly, the points we're going to raise, well, Blake reads like an atheist, thou art a man, God is no more, thine own humanity learn to adore, which, people like Yeats, etc., are sort of saying, this is Nietzsche, this is a precursor of Nietzsche. I think Yeats wrote, Nietzsche completes Blake, which I don't accept, actually. I think there's fundamental, very, very deep differences between Nietzsche and Blake. But Blake's religion, his Christology, and is based on essentially a man in, first century Judea, inventing a God the Father, and telling these stories. Jesus was an artist for Blake who invented this vision of God. And in the final illuminated book that Blake does, The Ghost of Abel, when Satan appears from the grave of Abel, interestingly, not Cain, Satan rises from the form of Abel. And the best insult you can think for Jehovah, who's a character in one of the only times that Jehovah has a walk-on part in Blake's poetry, he says, Jehovah, thou human. So Blake clearly has, people invent gods in Blake's view. And this goes back to his earliest writings in All Religions Are One. He essentially says, religion has its roots in poetic genius. Basically, we invent stories. Marriage of Heaven and Hell, Plate 11, the ancient poets animated all sensible objects, giving them names and characteristics. So Blake actually, from the 19th century onwards, was very appealing to secularists, to free thinkers, because it's very, very clear that he's a deeply committed Christian, but his Christianity, I always like to say, William Blake had a church of one. And he did not proselytize, he did not want followers in that sense. He had them a little bit at the end of his life, although they largely didn't understand his religious views. He invented his own mythology because that's kind of what he wanted people to do. His mythology, the four zoas, etc., is almost like a working manual. This is how you go about creating your own mythos, your own worldview, your own cosmology. And I think that's one of the things that appeals incredibly to subsequent generations of writers, artists, of whom Maurice Sendak is one of many. That Blake is not about, and this goes back to where we started with the dogmatism of children's literature, also the dogmatism of adult life. That rather than telling us what it is we should think, what Blake, in his famous quote from Jerusalem, I must create a system or be enslaved by another man's. And by the same process, he's not creating the false zoas. He doesn't want us to be does not want us to worship Urizen. The whole point is that this is a warning of falling into that trap. And I think that sense of the world of imagination creates everything that we understand around us. That's what appeals to so many figures such as Sendak and many others.
Thank you. Can we move on one slide and come back to the Jewish law? Kerry's just said in the chat that Sendak also illustrated some of the stories of Isaac Bashevis Singer, which he certainly did. And I'm going to end on this one. I think it's an opera, and I think this is quite chilling. So this was a book that, this is an image from a book that he created from an opera. He did a lot of set design throughout his life. He loved Mozart. He did the Magic Flute and many others. Mozart himself appears in a lot of illustrations. But there is an opera called Brunderbar that was written. This opera was written in the concentration camps. It was written by the Jews to be performed by the Jewish children in the concentration camps. It was performed. Brunderbar is the Yiddish word for a bumblebee, and the bumblebee is a kind of an embodiment of the bad adult, and the children and the animals have to work together to defeat the evil adults. I think most chillingly of all, and when Brunderbar was performed in the concentration camps, it was put on by the Nazis as a great show for the guests who were brought round to see it, to show them how well these people were being treated, how much fun they were having. And within months of that, all of those children had been killed in the gas chambers. All of the adults who were performing alongside them had been killed in the gas chambers. It was entirely for show. And Brunderbar somehow, was revived in the 1980s. It was performed for the first time in the West, and later on, it was performed in America. Maurice Sendak did the set design, and he also wrote it with Tony Kushner into a book, and it's here. And this image here, the wicked never win, we have our victory yet, tyrants come along, but you just wait and see. They topple one, two, three, our friends make us strong, and thus we end our song, is the end of Brunderbar. And Maurice Sendak would have written that knowing that actually that isn't what happened to those children. That's not the way that it ended. I think the only other thing I was going to say about Jewish law, in Jewish law there are giants. There are many, many giants in the Hebrew scriptures, and I think Maurice Sendak did actually write one of these giants into Miami at one point, and they look very Blakey, the giants he's got sort of stomping across the American landscape. So I think that we could have a separate discussion about giants, but we won't go there. So can I suggest that we open it out into questions? I've seen bits of the chat flashing up, but if you'd like to ask a question, do you want to come on screen? Would you like to raise your hand so I can see? And then I can't see.
Well, Hans gave up. I just want to address. There's a very interesting little conversation going on about Christian atheism and the influence of Swedenborg, etc.
Okay.
I toyed with the Christian atheist, and so it just sounded so ridiculous. So actually, I think what Blake was a Christian atheist. And no, scratch that, because
I see there's a humanism there. I see it as a kind of,
I used to work with a friend who was the editor of the Humanist magazine, and I've always had a erratic and irrational hatred of humanists. Sorry, I shouldn't say that out loud. That's a terrible thing to say, but
on that note,
yeah,
Kerry,
on that note.
Kerry, would you like to unmute yourself? And I think you're muted still.
Okay.
Thank you. Go ahead.
Well, am I expected to speak?
I thought were you not on screen because you'd asked a question?
I don't really want to say anything more about Christian atheism because it's something I'm thinking about at the moment and trying to come to terms with and actually get around to reading Tom Altizer. I don't think anybody ever bothers to read Tom Altizer, certainly not Christians, even though he's a very eminent theologian. No, what I wanted to point out, make sure you've only got a week to get to Cambridge for the Fitzwilliam's Blake's Universe. Well, just over. What I wanted to say is that also the first opportunity any of us in England have had to see work by Philip Otto Runge. And Runge is another of Sendak's enthusiasms. So you can go to Cambridge and think about Sendak as well as Blake and Runge. Okay, I think that's probably all I want to say at the moment. Okay.
Thank you very much, Kerry. I can't see, unless I'm looking in the wrong place, I can't see any hands up in the on the screen among people. Have anyone got any questions in the
John, if you'd like to unmute yourself.
John, John, you're muted at the moment. Do you want to, if you press on the bottom left-hand side, you're selected.
Right at the beginning, there was a lovely Blake picture with three wild things on the right-hand side and a couple of what I take to be angels on the left-hand side. I think that was about the first full slide. What was that? Where did that picture come from?
I'm trying to work out which image you mean.
Was it the one from Dante? I've got to go into my email. Let's pull them back up to remind
And I've got it printed out here, helpfully.
Right, yes. So the ones from Dante of them being chased. No. And
Oh, I think it is the second image. The second image, this one.
well, that,
No, is it this one, John? You're muted again. John, you're muted again. I can't
this
hear
is
you.
Dante being chased. It's from the beginning, the prelude to the Inferno. So Dante finds himself in the wild and is being pursued.
Yes.
I've got it behind me, but it might be Canto. I think it's Canto 1. But yeah.
Once I go there.
Yeah. Okay. John, you're still muted. We can't hear you at all.
Okay, I'll see if
I was just saying thank you, Jason. I've got a copy of the Dante illustrations. I'll look it up.
Yeah, no, it's the one that, and actually we didn't do a lot about the Dante illustrations, but when Tamsin produced the graphic to illustrate the talk, that the griffin that I'm going to call it griffin, the creature that draws Beatrice in Paradiso has an incredible parallel to one of the monsters that's illustrated there. So go back and have a look at the graphic
Okay.
to illustrate the talk. So again, it's just one of those various texts that seem to have influenced Sendak's style. I wanted to add, I did want to interrupt when you were talking, Tamsin, but in fact, I'll just hold one up. You're talking about the cross-hatching. I've never really thought about that with regard to Sendak's work, but I love the fact that, you know, in Gates of Paradise, which I do think Sendak must have seen on a fairly regular basis, because it simply was one of the most readily available copies of Blake around. The kind of the incredible cross-hatching that takes place in the designs for, for the designs for Gates of Paradise, which would have been incredibly influential, as in children's authors, children's illustrators of the time. So I just wanted to thank you for drawing that to my attention. I've never really thought.
That's okay. And just, you know, as an illustrator, I work traditionally. I don't work digitally at all. I work in ink. So, and actually, I thought this little tiny detail was, for those of you who are attending who are illustrators, if you look, I'm going to hold it really close to the camera. I'm just hoping it can focus well enough. If you look really closely at that cross-hatching in those end papers, you'll notice that it's done in lots and lots of, you probably can't quite see, lots and lots of tiny little squares. Each of those squares, he hasn't paid much attention to where they overlap, but each one of those squares is the exact amount that one of the crow quills of ink could hold in that time. So when his quill ran out of ink, he moved on and did the next. And actually, that's the kind of thing that you miss when you work digitally. It's that kind of detail that is no longer there when you're an illustrator. It's that, you know, it's that detail that your materials actually confine or define what it is that you're doing. Are there any other questions? Joan, do you want to come on? Joan, do you want to unmute yourself? It's on the bottom left-hand side. There's a little button saying mute. If you click that, you should be unmuted. That's it.
Okay, good. Hi, and thank
Hello,
you,
Joan.
everybody. Hi. I just wanted to say something about Sendak that's quite anecdotal. Years ago in the 80s, we wanted to invite him to speak at Long Island University, and where I was a professor. Anyway, no one knew how to find him. And I said, he lives in Manhattan, get the Manhattan phone book. So I called him. He was extremely charming and he agreed to come out and he did a talk for us. At the end of the talk, when he took questions, someone asked him, where did you get the ideas for the wild things and where the wild things are? And he said, oh, that's an easy question. Those are my aunts and uncles. they always terrified me when I was a kid. They would pinch me and pat me on the head, and I found them monstrous. He was very funny. And, you know, I thought about that over the years as it stayed with me. Anyway, thank you for discussing the books and Blake. I feel extremely relieved to know that Blake was a Christian atheist. That has resolved my fears all these years. So thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Joan. Yes, he talks a lot about how where those monsters come from, and that, you know, it's the adults to him who are the monsters. It's the adults who descend on them at the weekend, you know, and eat everything and are generally horrible. And of course, as a child, you're looking really closely at these adults, and you're seeing the nasal hair and the, you know, the bumpy ears, and the, you know, of course, as children, that they were required to be present, and then that's what they talked about when they left the room. Is that, oh, did you see this and did you see that? They really became, you know, for him the monsters.
Oh, I like that. Yes.
So like the notion of the Wild Things are as a child's divine comedy. That's very, I love that. That's a brilliant suggestion.
It is. Is there any more questions? Has anyone would like to put their hand up? Would anybody like to? Kerry, would you like to unmute yourself again?
Yeah.
Wonderful.
Okay. I just wanted to mention a couple of other things I've now remembered. There's Sendak's illustrations to, can you see it? Melville's Pierre.
Yes, yes.
First of all the illustrations, as I understand it, Sendak asked, can they be the same size as Blake's illustrations to the songs?
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, he wanted that. And there are deliberate Blake quotes. There's, oh, I think this must come from Little Tom the Sailor. Oh, can I, oh God, it's a bizarre process of trying to get your image on the screen. There we are, Little Tom the Sailor. The other work I wanted to mention is, you see, Lullabies and Night Songs.
Oh,
It has, do you know it?
yes.
It's got Alec Wilder's setting, I could find it now, of, oh, I've lost it, where is it?
Well, it looks again, the Pierre one's very reminiscent of one of the Gates of Paradise, the figure hemmed in.
It's Wilder's setting of Cradle Song, Blake's Cradle Song. But what I like, oh God, how do I get this on
Not
the
easy, is it,
screen?
Gary? I can try to do that.
It's what I particularly like in Cassandra is the lion looking after the baby in the cradle. That's favorite Sendak moment. Okay, that's all I have to say.
Thank you. I was going to say, but I knew about the Herman Melville, and he wrote a little book about a boy called Pierre later on. And he rhymes it with "I don't care." So little Pierre is the child who says "I don't care," and actually ends up getting sort of more or less eaten by a lion. And lions turn up as well in this lovely little book here, which is called Higgledy Piggledy Pop, or There Must Be More to Life. His beloved dog Jenny, who also turns up in Where the Wild Things Are, the little dog that Max chases down the stairs, is also Jenny. This little, so it looks like a Westie or something. I don't know what sort of dog Jenny was. But when he knew Jenny was dying, he wrote this little book called Higgledy Piggledy Pop, in which she goes off to explore the world and ends up performing in a production of Mother Goose's Higgledy Piggledy Pop. And, you know, in order to get there, she goes through this series of extraordinarily Kafkaesque sort of adventures, which involve trying to feed a baby that won't eat, and then avoid being eaten by a lion. And then the baby magically becomes Mother Goose. And then it's got this charming ending where, you know, Jenny writes back to her owner and says, "As you probably noticed, I went away forever. I'm very experienced now and very famous. I'm even a star. Every day I eat a mop twice on Saturdays. It is made of salami and that is my favorite. I get plenty to drink too, so don't worry. I can't tell you how to get to Castle Yonder because I don't know where it is, but if you ever come this way, look for me, Jenny. So that was his last words, about his dog, who he knew was dying at that point. So I think, like a lot of Sendak's works, it's both very, very humorous and also very poignant. So are there any further questions? I'm sort of looking in the chat box as well to see if anything's been flagged up. Has anyone got any further points they'd like to make? I don't want to cut anyone off if they haven't.
I do. If I can get my video. Let's see, where am I? Oh, here I am. Hi, everybody. I just wanted
Hi,
to
Amy.
hello and thank you for this. This was so wonderful.
Thank you.
I think the last time, Tamsin, I heard you speaking at a Blake Society event, you were actually talking about children and children's sensibility and the way children understand things. And I've been meaning to drop you a line. I can't remember whether I actually did, that I quoted you in my book just come out. So you're actually quoted, so you're there. And I was trying to find a way to send you a message on Zoom, but I can't make it work. So I'll try and do that later. But
okay, thank
just
you,
wanted, but I just wanted to say thank you to you both for this. I've been teaching a seminar on Blake, and the students responded so powerfully to the same kind of moments you're describing here, where they feel the child's sensibility, sort of in the classic romantic sense of the spot within that preserves our ability to react to things honestly, that responds to feeling, to emotion in a very raw, very immediate way. And we had an interesting moment with this in another class, in a very sort of Blakean moment, when we were talking about ecology, reading a writer called Edward O. Wilson, who, as part of his writing on the biosphere, asks students to name a series of American freshwater river mussel species that have gone extinct. And as part of that, we read the passage aloud. You're saying the names aloud, the Kusapikito, the Apalachicola rover, you say the names. And we talked about Black Lives Matter protests, but we also talked about your friend Jackie Morris's The Lost Spells, with regards to that, which students absolutely loved. So I just want to say and lift up again, I think it's easy for those of us who have the privilege of teaching, to have this get lost in the everyday. But our students, even with everything else that's going on, are so in need of wonder and so hungry for it. And they find that in Sendak, they find that in Blake, they find that in the natural world. They're still just so eager to encounter that. And I'm so grateful for this presentation today that has put me back in this space with it. So I'm grateful to you both for that, and all of our friends and colleagues here.
Thank you very much, Amy. That's a really nice way, I think, to end. I can't see any more questions have come in. Thank you all for attending. We will put this up online when we can. We all work here as sort of volunteers, so we'll do it when our work situations allow. Can I just flag up before we end the next Blake Society event, which is with Dr. Sarah Walton. It's on the 12th of June in the evening. It will be on Zoom, and it's a writing workshop. Ian has kindly put an image on the screen. Do go and explore the Blake Society's website. If you click on events, you'll see all the events that we do as the Blake Society. The vast majority of our events are free and open to everybody, and we try to keep things that way. When we can, we like to have a rolling program of stuff that's very open. If you follow the link there as well, you will also see a link that is Global Blake, which is a global academic network, collects and collates together all of the events that are flagged up that are related to Blake in any way at all going on around the world. And that listing is also available through our website and on Global Blake as well. So if you're an academic and haven't found Global Blake, please do go and explore it. There are lots of articles, including one that was flagged up quite recently about Maurice Sendak and Blake on the Global Blake network. So there's plenty to explore. And thank you all for your lovely comments. So good night. I think that's all. I've done my air hostess bit. I think we can end things. Thank you very much.